In the shadowy parlors and candlelit clinics of 19th century America, medicine was an uncharted wilderness, a mix of earnest curiosity, guesswork, and sometimes sheer desperation. Doctors wore their authority like armor, yet they often faced baffling illnesses they struggled to understand. Among the most perplexing of these was a condition so mysterious it seemed to embody the fears and hopes of an entire society: female hysteria. Hysteria was no simple ailment. It was a catch-all diagnosis, a blanket term for a bewildering array of symptoms: fainting spells, nervousness, emotional outbursts, insomnia, and inexplicable bodily pains. Today, many of these signs might be recognized as anxiety, depression, or other psychological and neurological disorders. But in the 1800s, hysteria was viewed as a uniquely female malady, something that sprang from the womb, the mysterious wandering uterus, and reflected a woman's delicate, often fragile constitution. The roots of hysteria run deep in history. The term itself comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. Ancient physicians believed the uterus could move around inside the body, causing all manner of distress. While those ideas seemed archaic by the Victorian era, the concept of hysteria endured, adapted by doctors to fit their modern world. By the 19th century, hysteria had become a booming area of medical interest, a diagnosis that simultaneously fascinated and terrified physicians. To many, hysteria wasn't just an illness but a symbol of a woman's social and psychological state. Victorian society prized women who were delicate, obedient, and serene. Hysteria challenged those ideals. It was a marker of disorder, a sign that a woman's body and mind were out of sync with the strict expectations placed upon her. In this strange cultural moment, doctors sought treatments to tame hysteria, using methods that ranged from the conventional to the bizarre. Some treatments were grounded in early scientific theory, others in social control. Rest cures, electrical devices, herbal potions, and physical therapies were all prescribed with varying success, and often with profound consequences. Among the many doctors experimenting with treatments for hysteria was one particularly notable figure: an American physician who believed he had found a radical cure, one that blurred the line between therapy and discipline. His treatment? Spanking. Yes, spanking. This was not punishment in the ordinary sense, but a medical intervention intended to restore balance and calm to the troubled female nervous system. It sounds shocking today, even absurd, but in the context of Victorian medicine and social norms, it was taken seriously. How did spanking come to be seen as a treatment? What does this reveal about Victorian attitudes toward women, medicine, and control? And most importantly, what was life like for the women who underwent such therapies? In the following hour, we will explore the story of the doctor who prescribed spanking for hysteria, a tale of medicine, gender, and power in a society struggling to define the role of women and the limits of science. In the swirling world of 19th century American medicine, few names stand out like Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. Born in Philadelphia in 1829, Mitchell was a man of contrasts, a respected neurologist and psychologist who made lasting contributions to medicine, yet also the architect of some of the most controversial and puzzling treatments ever prescribed to women. Mitchell's rise to prominence coincided with a time when medical science was still emerging from the shadows of superstition and guesswork. His work focused largely on nervous system disorders, a field then known as neurology but still deeply intertwined with psychological theories and social expectations. Among the many conditions he treated, hysteria was one of his primary concerns. But Mitchell was not merely a cold scientist. He was a product of his time, shaped by the Victorian culture that valued order, restraint, and strict gender roles. Women were seen as the bearers of virtue and moral guardians of the home, but also as fragile beings whose health could be easily disrupted by emotional stress or improper behavior. When hysteria struck, it was both a medical problem and a social warning. Mitchell developed what became known as the rest cure, a treatment regimen designed to restore fragile women to health by enforcing strict rest and seclusion. Patients were ordered to lie in bed for weeks or even months, forbidden from working, reading, or engaging in intellectual activity. Meals were brought to them, and stimulation of any kind was carefully limited. This regime was meant to soothe the nervous system by removing all external pressures. But Mitchell's rest cure went beyond rest alone. He believed that some physical interventions were necessary to break the cycle of hysteria. It was here that spanking, or therapeutic physical discipline, entered the picture. Mitchell thought that carefully administered spanking could stimulate blood flow and nerve endings, relieve pent-up tension, and calm the nerves. In his eyes, it was a scientific method to help women regain balance in their bodies and minds. Mitchell's ideas were radical, even for his time. Letters and diaries from women who underwent his treatments reveal a complex picture. Some felt relief from their symptoms, while others experienced confusion, humiliation, or even trauma. The rest cure confined women to isolation, and the physical interventions added a layer of discomfort and social taboo. Yet, despite the controversy, Mitchell's work gained widespread acceptance in certain medical circles. His patients included some of the most privileged women of American society, and his reputation as a doctor was significant. He also treated soldiers suffering from nerve injuries in the Civil War, further establishing his influence. The story of Silas Weir Mitchell is not just a medical history but a window into the social anxieties of his era. His treatments reflected fears about female sexuality, independence, and the need to maintain strict social order. Women's bodies became sites of control, their illnesses interpreted through a lens of morality as much as medicine. Understanding Mitchell helps us grasp why spanking was ever considered a legitimate therapy. It also opens a broader conversation about the intersections of science, culture, and gender, and the ways medical authority has been used to enforce societal norms. In the next section, we will dive deeper into the rest cure itself, exploring how bed rest, isolation, and discipline combined to form one of the most infamous treatments in history, a regimen that entrapped many women in silence and confinement. Imagine a room with pale yellow wallpaper, high ceilings, and heavy velvet curtains drawn against the sun. A woman lies in bed, not because she wants to, but because she's been told she must. She is not ill with fever, nor crippled by injury. Her malady is more elusive. It is her thoughts, her nerves, her femininity. This was the world of the rest cure, Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell's signature remedy for women suffering from what doctors politely termed hysteria, and what husbands often called too many opinions. By the late 1800s, it had become one of the most widely prescribed treatments for middle and upper-class women in America and Britain. And it was hardly restful. At first glance, the rest cure seemed gentle, even luxurious. Patients were confined to bed, often in private rooms or sanitariums that mimicked the comforts of home. They were told not to read, not to write, not to think too hard, and certainly not to speak about their worries. They were, essentially, put in a kind of sensory and intellectual lockdown. Mitchell believed that a woman's nervous system was like a delicate harp, beautiful, but easily thrown out of tune by overstimulation. So the cure involved removing everything that might excite or agitate the patient. That meant no novels, no letter writing, no political conversations. Even embroidery could be too taxing. Meals were rich in cream, butter, and beef, intended to fatten up patients who, according to Mitchell, had grown too thin from their mental exertions. In some cases, women gained 40 pounds during treatment. But food was not the only thing administered. Patients were sometimes spoon-fed milk or broth like infants, in an attempt to regress them to a childlike state of passivity. Nurses, or sometimes the husbands themselves, were assigned to enforce these rules with rigid discipline. If the patient resisted, cried, or tried to leave the bed, the consequences were not always gentle. Mitchell warned against indulging female emotion. To give in, he said, was to let hysteria win. This is where the line between comfort and coercion began to blur. In more stubborn cases, physical punishments were introduced, spanking among them. The idea was to shock the nervous system back into balance. Mitchell did not always describe this openly in his publications, but letters and personal accounts from patients suggest that such measures were not unheard of. Whether viewed as therapeutic or disciplinary, they sent a clear message: you are not in control of your body. We are. Even respected writers were not immune. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the author of The Yellow Wallpaper, famously underwent the rest cure under Mitchell's supervision. Her doctor told her to abandon writing and domestic ambition altogether. She was to become a quiet housewife, and nothing more. Instead, she spiraled into deeper depression, eventually penning a story about a woman driven mad by yellow wallpaper and confinement. And that wasn't fiction. It was survival. The rest cure treated women's independence as a disease. Ambition was a symptom. Curiosity was a threat. Mitchell's methods may have stemmed from genuine concern, but they echoed the fears of a society desperate to keep women in their place. There was no equivalent treatment for men. A man who suffered from nervous exhaustion was more likely to be prescribed outdoor activity, vigorous travel, or a return to work. In fact, Mitchell invented a counterpart called the West Cure for such men, a regimen of horseback riding, hunting, and ranch labor in the wild American frontier. In other words, men were sent to conquer nature. Women were told to become part of the furniture. And so, the rest cure flourished in parlors and sanatoriums throughout the late 19th century, its soft linens hiding a harder truth. Thousands of women were made to lie still, not to heal, but to conform. To be cured of their thoughts, their hopes, their dreams. To stop asking for too much. Some women smiled when they left the rest cure. Not because they were healed, but because they had learned how to pretend. In the quiet corners of America's parlors and sanitariums, patients who had endured weeks, sometimes months, of imposed stillness began to realize something chilling. They were expected to be better, even if they weren't. And the only proof of better was obedience. Compliance. A return to quiet. But not everyone stayed silent. We have their letters, tucked into private journals, smuggled between sisters, scribbled in trembling hand behind drawn curtains. These were the unsanctioned voices of women who had survived the rest cure. They had been forbidden to write, forbidden to think. And so, naturally, they did both. Some letters are bitter, others eerie, but nearly all speak of one emotion, a slow erasure of self. Take the case of Grace Wetherill, a Quaker woman from Philadelphia. In an 1884 letter to her cousin, she described her 6-week stay at a sanitarium as a burial above ground. She wrote, "The doctor says I am nearly well, but I cannot say what I am. I feel no more like Grace than the drapes feel like a tree." Others wrote of the peculiar way time passed in confinement. Days were long, but thought was discouraged. The clock ticked, but the mind was to remain still. Martha Downing, a school teacher from Boston, wrote, "He says my nerves are frayed from study, that I must lie here and learn to be simple. But my thoughts crawl along the ceiling like ants. Quiet, but alive." In a world where a woman's nervous breakdown could be diagnosed by a male doctor after a mere conversation, many patients quickly learned how to perform recovery. They smiled. They ate. They stopped complaining. And then, when no one was looking, they wrote. They wrote about the powerlessness of being treated like a child. They wrote about the anger of being dismissed as irrational. They wrote about the shame of being touched, spanked, or humiliated in the name of treatment. Yes, the punishments were real. Though rarely documented in official records, anecdotal evidence and oral histories confirm that physicians or attendants occasionally used disciplinary methods, including spanking, to enforce compliance, particularly in women deemed uncooperative. A few doctors defended this practice as startling the patient back into reason. Others didn't bother to justify it at all. In one case recounted in a 1901 issue of the Medical Gazette, a female patient in upstate New York was lightly chastised with a paddle after refusing food and crying for days. The doctor claimed it restored her appetite and respect. The patient never spoke of it again. But Eliza Randolph, a New Jersey woman treated in 1897, did. In a letter to her younger sister, she wrote, "He struck me 3 times across the thighs, not with cruelty but with certainty. I have never before been corrected like a child. And yet I felt no power to object. I said nothing. That silence has sickened me more than all else." This was the other side of Victorian medicine, where the boundary between cure and control was blurred by social hierarchy. Doctors were not only healers. They were enforcers of a deeply gendered code. A hysterical woman was not just ill. She was disobedient. And a disobedient woman needed correction. Sometimes through restriction. Sometimes through milk and silence. And sometimes through pain. These letters, though often lost to history, represent the counter-narrative. The voices doctors did not record, and husbands preferred not to hear. They offer us glimpses of women who were not passive, not fragile, not overwrought, but trapped. Trapped in systems that disguised obedience as wellness. Trapped in lace-draped cells with floral wallpaper and locked windows. Trapped by men who genuinely believed they were helping. This is perhaps the strangest part of the story. Many of the doctors prescribing these cures were not villains. They were educated, respected, genuinely concerned about their patients. But they were also products of their time, a time that believed a woman's uterus could wander through her body, causing madness. A time that called ambition a symptom and curiosity a disorder. Even Silas Weir Mitchell, the godfather of the rest cure, insisted that his methods were humane. He published essays defending his approach as scientific, restorative, and deeply effective. And in many cases, patients did emerge physically stronger, heavier, calmer, slower. But at what cost? The story of hysteria is older than stethoscopes. Long before Victorian doctors prescribed bed rest, milk diets, or spankings, physicians in ancient civilizations were puzzling over a very specific mystery. Why did women behave so unpredictably? The answer, they believed, was simple. Her womb had gone rogue. In ancient Greece, the female uterus was seen not just as an organ, but as a sentient creature. Physicians like Hippocrates and Aretius believed it could move within the body, floating upward toward the lungs or pressing against the heart, disrupting emotions and causing madness. They called it the wandering womb. A woman overcome with emotion, her womb had drifted toward the chest. A woman refusing to eat, the womb was sulking near her stomach. A woman laughing or weeping without reason. Clearly, the womb was disoriented and needed coaxing back to its proper place. The recommended treatments: perfumed suppositories, fumigations, pelvic massages, and, more often than not, marriage. Greek doctors advised that the best way to settle a misbehaving womb was regular intercourse and childbirth. A barren womb, they warned, was a restless womb. Womanhood, in this view, was not a condition, it was a diagnosis, and heterosexual submission was the only cure. This belief passed through centuries like a torch, flickering but never quite extinguished. In medieval Europe, female madness was often seen as a spiritual crisis, a sign of possession or moral failing. Women who suffered seizures, depression, or outbursts might be labeled witches. Others were subjected to holy rituals, exorcisms, flagellations, isolation. For a time, the devil was the preferred diagnosis. By the 17th century, medicine tried to reclaim the field. But the tools were crude, and the theories weren't much better. Physicians still treated the womb as an unpredictable, heat-sensitive organ. Some believed that too much education could overheat a woman's mind and damage her reproductive health. Others warned that if a woman read too much poetry, her uterus would rebel, leading to fainting spells, melancholy, or worse. In France, the word hysteria gained popularity in medical texts. It came from the Greek hysteria, womb. And though treatments were becoming more clinical, the fundamental idea remained. If a woman showed signs of emotional excess, something was wrong with her biology, with her womanhood. She was not thinking too much, she was malfunctioning. By the 18th and 19th centuries, hysteria had become a fashionable affliction, especially among upper-class women. It was considered both dangerous and oddly elegant. In literature, the hysterical woman was pale, delicate, mysterious. In real life, she was often exhausted, trapped, or grieving. Doctors now began categorizing hysteria: hysterical paralysis, hysterical blindness, hysterical mutism. These were real symptoms, women who could no longer walk, speak, or see, with no identifiable physical cause. And because male physicians rarely believed these conditions were genuine, they concluded they must be imaginary. Enter the era of nervous disorders. Hospitals began establishing neurasthenia wards and private asylums catered to women with hysteria. Treatments ranged from the absurd to the violent: hydrotherapy, induced vomiting, electroshock, even surgical removal of the clitoris, all in pursuit of restoring feminine balance. But no matter the method, one message rang clear. A woman who felt too much needed to be corrected. This idea bled into every part of society. A girl who resisted marriage could be called hysterical. A wife who refused her husband's advances might be labeled frigid or insane. A mother overwhelmed by grief was told to calm herself for the children's sake. And when all else failed, there was always the rest cure. By the time Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell rose to prominence in the late 1800s, hysteria was no longer just a symptom, it was an entire industry. His rest cure became a tidy way to remove difficult women from view. No need for chains or straitjackets. Just a soft bed, a locked door, and a long list of things not to do. What began as a medical theory had become a cultural reflex. Women were sad. Hysteria. Women were angry. Hysteria. Women were simply not smiling. Hysteria. Even as feminist writers and early psychologists began to question these practices, the public perception remained unchanged. The word hysterical, once clinical, was now casual, a synonym for irrational, emotional, female, and so, the ancient myth of the wandering womb never quite died. It simply changed shape. From perfumed remedies to psychiatric labels. From fumigations to pharmaceuticals. The tools evolved. The impulse did not. The womb might no longer be blamed outright. But the assumption lingered. If a woman was not well, it must be her own nature that was wrong. By the 1870s, hysteria had evolved into a kind of social wildcard. It could mean almost anything: irritability, fainting, restlessness, nervous laughter, insomnia, even excessive reading. But here was the catch: the cure didn't really exist. Or rather, there were too many of them. Enter the era of curious cure-alls. Doctors, some well-meaning, some more enterprising, began recommending anything that might calm the female nerves. Warm milk, ice baths, horse riding, leeching, Turkish baths, goat's milk enemas, and, yes, spanking. But not the ordinary kind. This was therapeutic spanking. Or, as some physicians began calling it in hushed tones, manual stimulation of the pelvic region to relieve congestion. Some doctors genuinely believed that physical manipulation of the lower abdomen, via spanking or massage, could release built-up humors or restore female vitality. Others were simply using pseudoscience to justify questionable behavior under the veil of medical authority. But the most fascinating aspect of all this, many of the patients believed it too. In one particularly revealing case, a woman from Boston wrote in her diary that her doctor had treated her most vigorously for the madness that struck each time her husband left on business. The treatment, she claimed, left her feeling refreshed, exhausted, and strangely content. She returned weekly. Physicians, particularly those in private practice, began carving out a quiet but steady income stream from these so-called hysterical cases. The medical massage became a discreet euphemism, and spanking, often recommended to jolt the womb from its lethargy, crept into medical journals as a perfectly acceptable, if rarely publicized, remedy. Some even published step-by-step guides. One 1872 London pamphlet titled On the Physical Reinvigoration of the Nervous Woman described a process of rhythmic slapping upon the posterior and lower spine, alternating with firm circular motions. It was, the author assured, an art rather than a science. Was it exploitative? Undoubtedly. But the grey zone between medicine and morality was precisely where many Victorian-era physicians operated. Some were true believers. Others saw opportunity. A few, as letters and court records suggest, were sued. And all of this was occurring in an age when a woman couldn't vote, couldn't attend most universities, and could be legally committed to an asylum by her husband's signature alone. So who really had the power? There were women who rejected this entirely, of course. Early feminists like Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States, condemned these treatments as barbaric misunderstandings of feminine vitality. Blackwell believed hysteria was largely a social construction, that women needed education, not stimulation. But it was hard to out-argue an entire system built around the authority of men in white coats. Some doctors even invented devices to do the job for them. Yes, this is where things get even stranger. By the late 19th century, the so-called vibrating manipulator had entered the scene. It was marketed as a labor-saving tool for overworked doctors, though some records suggest it was often purchased privately. One had described it as an invigorator for mind and muscle, restoring grace, composure, and restful sleep. But the device had a more infamous nickname, the pelvic massager. Its purpose was, shall we say, to expedite the hysterical relief process, sparing doctors the manual labor. It plugged into the wall. It whirred. It buzzed. And it sold. Hospitals began ordering them. Wealthy women had them installed in private chambers. Some hotels even offered the service as part of luxury spa packages. To be clear, no one was officially admitting what these machines really did. The language remained euphemistic. But everyone knew. And beneath all this, the spanking, the massages, the machines, was something simpler, a hunger for understanding, for attention, for intimacy. Most of these women weren't mad at all. They were lonely, misunderstood, trapped in corsets of expectation with no language for what they felt. And so they turned to the only people who would listen, the doctors. And the doctors, some of them anyway, listened with their hands. The irony? Much of this would later be swept away by the rise of talk therapy. As Freud and his contemporaries took center stage in the early 20th century, the idea of touching patients gave way to analyzing them. No more spanking. No more vibrators in hospitals. Just long couches and even longer conversations. But for a curious stretch of time, barely 3 decades, really, the medical world operated on a bizarre blend of repression and release. And while the official record tiptoed around it, the private diaries, court transcripts, and physicians' notes told the truth. The doctor didn't just write prescriptions. Sometimes, he gave spankings. And, in that strange Victorian logic, everyone involved, doctor and patient alike, believed they were practicing science. By the 1880s, the hysteria diagnosis had blossomed into a full-blown cultural obsession, not just a medical condition, but a fashionable affliction among the upper middle class. It was whispered about in drawing rooms. It was diagnosed in parlors. It was treated in hushed visits behind velvet curtains. For women of a certain class, it was almost expected. One Boston physician complained in a private letter that he was positively overrun with cases. Another in New York referred to his patients as a trembling army of nerves and bustled skirts. In London, some ladies even took pride in their delicate conditions. A well-managed hysteria made one seem more refined, more in touch with the emotional sensitivities of a cultivated mind. It was a performance, in part, a way of coping with lives that were otherwise painfully constrained. A woman couldn't go to medical school, or open a bank account, or inherit property in many states. But she could take to her bed. She could faint. She could retreat behind a floral curtain and be unwell. And in doing so, she bought herself time. Space. Attention. Some did it to escape their husbands. Others to avoid sexual duties. A few simply wanted to rest. And the doctors? They kept showing up. With their tinctures, their gloves, their vibrating machines. Many, perhaps most, believed they were doing good work. After all, their patients got better. They left the office smiling. They returned, week after week. One New York doctor, famed among society women for his excellent bedside manner, allegedly kept a standing appointment list that ran months in advance. His wife, suspicious of the procession of flushed women arriving at odd hours, was eventually institutionalized herself, diagnosed, of course, with hysteria. There were ironies within ironies. But even as all this unfolded in refined neighborhoods, something more troubling was happening further down the social ladder. Working-class women, factory girls, domestic servants, laundresses, also showed symptoms of what might have been called hysteria. But they didn't have drawing rooms. They didn't have private physicians or vibrating devices. They had rough supervisors, punishing hours, and no permission to be delicate. So their complaints were dismissed. Or punished. In some asylum records from 1886, a woman was committed after she refused to do her husband's laundry, claiming it made her feel numb and full of fire. She was labeled hysterical. Another, who cried for days after her child died, was similarly institutionalized, her grief reclassified as an illness. The class divide within hysteria became more pronounced. Rich women got velvet curtains and medical massages. Poor women got cold baths and padded cells. And race played a part, too. Black women, often seen as less refined by the twisted logic of 19th century medicine, were rarely diagnosed with hysteria at all. Their suffering was either ignored, criminalized, or described in grotesque terms. The very same symptoms that earned white women the gentle touch of a physician earned others suspicion, shame, or restraint. It was never really about health. It was about control. Control over behavior, over bodies, over a society in transition. Because deep down, Victorian culture was terrified of change, of women who spoke their minds, of shifting power dynamics. And so hysteria became a convenient tool. A way to label what wasn't understood. A way to pathologize protest, passion, or even boredom. And behind it all, quietly, the medical industry boomed. By 1890, advertisements for nerve tonics and female restoratives flooded newspapers. One syrup promised to soothe the nervous woman without dulling her spirit. Another contained trace amounts of opium, a spoonful of peace, taken twice daily. Even department stores got in on the trend. Some began selling lavender-scented, soothing gloves for self-treatment. Others offered home versions of pelvic massages, discreetly labeled as personal physiotherapy devices. The stigma around hysteria was shrinking, not because it was more accepted, but because it was being commercialized. Treatments were now available by mail. Testimonials popped up in women's magazines. Mrs. L of Philadelphia no longer weeps at sunset, one had proclaimed, thanks to Dr. Harvey's vibratory tonic and his firm, reassuring technique. No one quite said what that meant. But everyone, somehow, knew. And still, the condition remained elusive. No two doctors agreed on its cause. No two patients described it the same way. It could appear suddenly and vanish without warning. It followed no clear rules, except one. It was always the woman's fault. Whether she read too much, spoke too freely, laughed too loudly, or simply wanted to be alone, the end result was often the same. A diagnosis, a prescription, a hand on the small of her back. And as the 19th century edged toward its final decade, hysteria clung stubbornly to its place in society. It was part diagnosis, part metaphor, part cultural myth. A mirror, really, reflecting not women's madness, but the madness of a world that refused to understand them. And so the doctors kept prescribing, and the women kept arriving. And somewhere behind those velvet curtains, the treatments continued. Imagine, if you will, being a woman in 1880. You're feeling restless, unfocused. You're weepy one day, irritable the next. You don't know what's wrong exactly, only that something is. You struggle to sleep. You burst into tears while darning socks. You snap at your children. And eventually, perhaps reluctantly, you are sent to the doctor. You walk into the consultation room expecting a tincture, or maybe just a lecture about your nerves. What you don't expect is to be told, in all clinical seriousness, that your condition stems from an overactive womb or wandering uterus, and that the prescribed cure is a spanking. It sounds absurd to us now, but for women back then, hysteria wasn't just a joke, it was a real and frightening diagnosis. And the suggested treatments often left them feeling more confused than cured. A number of accounts survive in personal letters and medical journals, though heavily veiled in euphemisms. Some women were prescribed manual stimulation by their physician. Yes, exactly what it sounds like, while others were told that marriage and regular conjugal relations would settle their nerves. If they were already married and still hysterical, they might be accused of failing to meet their wifely duties or, worse, of having immoral tendencies. Spanking, for some doctors, was the happy medium, not quite invasive, but still forceful enough to redirect the woman's misaligned energies. One doctor even claimed that the act of spanking relieved congestion in the lower spine, which he believed to be the origin point of many feminine disorders. Imagine the embarrassment, the awkward silence as the doctor cleared his throat, pulled up a stool, and explained that your recovery required a firm hand, quite literally. And even if the patient didn't object, you can imagine the confusion. Was this normal? Was it medical? Was she being punished for something? One can still find strange little entries in 19th century medical literature that make the modern reader stop and blink. In one article, a physician wrote about a woman who had suffered from melancholia for months. He tried laudanum. He tried rest. He tried a cold compress. But it wasn't until he administered a spanking with due firmness and frequency that she began to laugh and, supposedly, returned to health shortly afterward. Another doctor wrote of a young school teacher who collapsed from excessive moral strain. His recommendation: a carefully dosed combination of bed rest and disciplinary correction. Of course, none of this was framed as sexual. The Victorian mind was very good at compartmentalizing. These weren't spankings in the modern sense, but corrective procedures, often performed behind locked doors, sometimes with the help of a nurse, and almost always followed by meticulous notes in elegant handwriting. Some doctors seem to truly believe in the practice's efficacy. Others may have been indulging darker impulses behind the safety net of medicine. Either way, Women had few choices but to comply. But not all women went along with it. In the diaries of certain outspoken suffragists, we find sarcastic remarks about these so-called cures. One Boston woman wrote, "Dr. H has a new theory. He believes my sadness is caused by too much thinking. I should like to test his theory on him with a paddle and see if his gloom evaporates." Another, writing anonymously in a women's magazine, described a visit to a clinic in which the doctor suggested a disciplinary regimen. She excused herself under the pretense of needing fresh air, and never returned. Some women laughed about it privately. Others wrote scathing poems or bitter parodies of their doctor's recommendations. Still, many more endured the treatments in silence, unsure whether to feel grateful, humiliated, or just numb. Today, it's tempting to laugh at these stories, to shake our heads at the ridiculousness of it all. But it's also a sobering reminder of how medicine, when wrapped in the authority of white coats and Latin phrases, can go unquestioned, even when it crosses lines of ethics and dignity. It's easy to forget that hysteria wasn't just a diagnosis, it was a cultural tool. It turned women's emotions into symptoms. It took normal human experiences, grief, boredom, frustration, and labeled them as illnesses to be corrected. And in doing so, it left generations of women without the language or the permission to simply feel what they were feeling. Still, within the margins of the medical journals and in the whispers shared behind closed parlor doors, we can sense a quiet rebellion. A raised eyebrow, a smirk, a diary entry written in tiny script. Because while the doctors may have believed they were in control, the women, they weren't all so easily convinced. Some played along, some walked away, and a few, no doubt, found their own ways to heal, without the need for lectures or leather straps. By the 1890s, medicine was on the move, and so, apparently, was the uterus. The Victorian age may have clung to its corsets and propriety, but it was also an era of steam, electricity, and innovation. And when it came to treating female hysteria, doctors began to look beyond their own hands to machines. Yes, machines. The problem, they said, wasn't just the women. It was the labor. You see, manual treatments, like massage or spanking, were exhausting for physicians. One doctor even complained in a journal that he could only perform 4 or 5 treatments a day before his fingers cramped. Another wrote that some patients required stimulation for over an hour, and that such appointments were time-consuming and wearisome. Clearly, this was unsustainable. So in true 19th century fashion, a solution was engineered. In 1883, a British physician named Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville patented what he called the percussor. It was an electromechanical device that delivered rhythmic vibrations, originally intended for sore muscles and aching backs. But once word spread among doctors treating hysteria, the percussor found a new audience. Within a few short years, the electric vibrator, yes, that vibrator, had entered the medical market. Granville himself was horrified. He insisted his invention was for sore shoulders and stiff joints. He wanted nothing to do with the lower regions of medicine. But his device had, quite literally, struck a nerve. And other manufacturers quickly jumped into the business, producing mechanical devices for the discreet treatment of nervous disorders in women. For the proper lady of 1895, the trip to the doctor might now include a seat in a softly lit parlor, a modest screen, a nurse in uniform, and a machine that buzzed gently like a sewing machine. These devices were often mounted on tables or held like bulky hand tools. Some looked like chrome-plated lanterns. Others resembled something you'd find in a blacksmith's forge. They had attachments, rollers, pads, rounded tips, all designed to relieve the pelvic congestion of the average housewife. Treatment sessions lasted anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on the severity of the hysteria. And in case you're wondering, yes, many women came back regularly. This mechanical method had several advantages. It spared the doctor's hands. It required less awkward conversation. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed the whole business to remain just clinical enough to avoid scandal. After all, the machine was a medical device. Its settings were adjustable. Its surface could be sterilized. Surely there was no shame in science. As the 20th century approached, some clever minds realized, if doctors could use these machines, why couldn't women use them at home? By 1900, advertisements began appearing in women's magazines for personal massage devices. They were marketed as health aids, promising to improve circulation, restore energy, and promote feminine vitality. One ad featured a smiling woman in her drawing room holding what looked like a telephone receiver wired to a tabletop box. Another promised a quiet motor that delivered relief in just 10 minutes. These products were sold in department stores, mail-order catalogs, and discreetly wrapped parcels. Some came with instruction booklets. Others were recommended by pharmacists or even midwives. And so, slowly, what began as an embarrassing visit to the doctor's office became a household routine, a kind of ritual that blended medicine, mystery, and a not-so-hidden dose of pleasure. It's easy to snicker, but for many women, these machines were more than curiosities. They were the first means, however awkward or clinical, by which they could explore their own bodies. In a world where desire was forbidden, where husbands were often inattentive, and where female pleasure was dismissed as myth or madness, the mechanical treatment of hysteria gave women a strange sort of power. It let them feel something. And for once, no one called them sinful for it. They were simply following doctors' orders. Of course, the medical profession maintained its innocence. Even well into the 1920s, textbooks described these treatments in stern, mechanical terms. Pelvic massage, nervous therapy, vibratory intervention. The language was cold. The hands were gloved. But the outcomes were often euphoric. It wasn't until the rise of modern psychology and the decline of hysteria as a diagnosis that the practice began to fade. Machines were quietly retired. Doctors moved on to Freudian analysis and talk therapy. And the vibrator, once a respectable medical tool, slowly became something else entirely. And so, the cure for hysteria, once found in paddles and pulleys, ended not with a scandal, but with a silence. As women's medicine evolved, the machines were tucked away. The ads vanished from magazines. The manuals went out of print. But they didn't disappear entirely. They simply moved. From doctors' offices to bedside drawers. By the 1920s, hysteria was dying. Not with a bang, not even with a diagnosis, but with a quiet vanishing act, the kind history performs when science changes its mind. New terms were emerging: neurosis, depression, anxiety. The Freudians had arrived, clutching their cigars and talking about childhood. The electric machines were still humming in certain clinics, but their role was shrinking. The idea that a uterus could cause madness was growing harder to defend. Still, the ghost of hysteria lingered. Even as women earned the vote, bobbed their hair, and marched into universities, the old suspicions remained. If a woman cried too easily, she might be called unstable. If she refused to marry, she was unnatural. If she spoke too loudly, she was hysterical. The word still hissed in newspaper columns, courtroom dramas, and marital arguments. The medical world moved on, but society wasn't in such a hurry. In the 1930s and 40s, women who didn't fit the mold were often labeled with new names. Frigid, frustrated, neurotic. The packaging changed, but the assumptions didn't. Their bodies were still suspects, their desires still unspoken, and their symptoms, fatigue, mood swings, sadness, restlessness, were still treated with sedation, seclusion, or shame. One could be too emotional, too ambitious, too opinionated, and all of it, still, might be traced back to some supposed flaw in the female form. Ironically, many of the treatments for hysteria, meant to soothe or subdue, left women worse off. Barbiturates dulled their senses. Electroshock therapy, introduced in the mid-20th century, claimed to reboot the brain but often erased memories instead. Lobotomies, that darkest of interventions, were occasionally performed on difficult women who couldn't be managed any other way. The tools had grown colder, more surgical. But the goal remained eerily similar: to quiet the female body when it spoke too loudly. And yet, the whisper of hysteria refused to vanish entirely. Even today, women are more likely to be misdiagnosed with anxiety when presenting with heart attack symptoms. They are more likely to be told their pain is psychological, their fatigue stress-related, their questions overreactions. The ghost of hysteria floats quietly through modern emergency rooms and doctors' offices, wearing a white coat and a kind smile. If there was one thing hysteria taught society, it was how easily belief can become medicine. For centuries, doctors sincerely believed that a wandering uterus could make a woman faint or scream or forget her name. They believed that spanking could stabilize her mood, that electrical stimulation could restore her morals, that removing her teeth or ovaries could fix her spirit. They didn't think they were cruel. They thought they were helping. And that is the haunting part. Because behind every bizarre cure was a woman, real, breathing, frightened, whose body was misunderstood, whose voice was mistrusted, whose suffering was real even when the science was wrong. Some were wealthy and treated gently. Others were poor and treated like problems. Some were locked away. Some were married off. Some quietly disappeared from records altogether. But all of them, from the girl who wept at church to the wife who screamed in childbirth, were shaped by the shadow of hysteria. Today, hysteria exists mostly as a cultural joke, a dramatic outburst, a fainting woman in an old painting, a punchline in a period drama. But its history is not funny. It is a story of medicine's blind spots, of how society tried to pathologize emotion, independence, and sexuality, especially in women, for centuries. It is a story of discomfort dressed up as diagnosis, of science entangled with fear, of bodies reduced to symbols, and symbols mistaken for truth. And so, when we laugh at old cartoons of women swooning, or joke about someone being hysterical, we're echoing something deeper, a long and often painful tale of how little power women had over their own minds, their own treatments, and even their own names. Because while doctors had spent centuries trying to silence and control women's bodies, the very tools they built to do so ended up doing something else. They taught women about sensation, about pleasure, about autonomy. In their attempt to regulate desire, they had, accidentally, invented access. And somewhere, in a quiet parlor in 1910, a woman unwrapped a brown paper parcel, plugged in a polished little machine, and, for the first time in her life, discovered something no doctor could explain. Hysteria may have been a false diagnosis, but it left behind something real.